Okay, here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. I had to switch the water. It's been a heavy coffee day, and so got my water. And of course, we have another outstanding guest here with us, Sarah Hershey. I'm Eddie Moore Jr., founder. I go by he, him, and his. And Sarah, we've been doing coffee talks as a way to introduce our WPC family, our WPC community to each other better. We see each other at the conference, we see each other at other events, but sometimes we don't really get to know not only about the work you do at the conference in great deal, but what about the work you do when you go back from the conference or in the communities where you live, or the things leading up to the work that you do. So this is what we're trying to do with Coffee Talks, is to learn about all of that. So let's get started and just ask you, who are you and what do you do?
Well, thank you for having me, Eddie. The pronouns I use are she, her, and hers. And right now I am very immersed in the mom role while we have the kids home from school. But I also work as a private consultant doing racial justice work, specifically engaging white people in building capacity to be a part of anti-racism work, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I started my career actually as a middle school humanities teacher. And because I have a graduate degree in social justice education, I was very concerned in the classroom with how do I teach for social justice? How do I engage in a social justice pedagogy and process of self-reflection? And also I started doing part-time work with Natalie Thoreson of inVision Consulting, doing kind of pan-anti-oppression work. And when I started growing humans, became a parent, I switched into just doing the consulting work with Natalie, and allowed more flexibility. And it was actually Natalie who planted the seed in my brain that I start my own organization, because I was noticing that the work that I was doing was more and more focused on developing curriculum for and leading white accountability spaces, working with white school leaders on their own process of self-reflection and growth as white people, and aiming to be anti-racist people and engaging in anti-racist work. And so a few years ago, I started my own consulting organization called Courageous Change Consulting, whose mission is to help white people of diverse backgrounds to increase their capacity to identify, understand, discuss, and ultimately tackle racism. And by tackle, I mean to dismantle systems of white supremacy, but I decided that in a mission statement, it was probably better to just ease people into it. And so the work that I do now is primarily with schools and also with other parents of white kids. Both of my kids are white, to help educators and parents learn more about how to raise anti-racist white youth starting in early childhood. A lot of the lessons that I've learned were through making mistakes, especially with my first child, because that's the nature of parenting. Your first kid is your guinea pig, and if you have a second one, you get to do better based on all the ways you messed up with the first one. And I also do work with white folks around building resilience, so that they can really persevere through our inevitable mistakes and really keep their skin in the game. And also more recently, I've been really exploring with other Jewish folks, Ashkenazi heritage Jewish folks like myself, Jewish people whose heritage is from Central and Eastern Europe, looking at the really specific intersection of our Jewish identity and our white identity, particularly through the lens of personal trauma and generationally inherited trauma. And so I can talk more about that if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, three big categories I want to ask you about following up. One is definitely the work you're doing and have been doing with kids, young people, or at least people who work with young people. Secondly, white accountability, white resilience, white resistance, all the things associated with that, and really wanting to get a sense of how you're feeling about the landscape of white people's participation in the work of social justice. And then lastly, definitely want to speak a little bit about, have you speak a little bit more about some of the sweeping anti-racist, anti-Semitic incidents that are happening across our society, and the work you're doing within the Jewish community around white identity, but also what about collaboration and partnership with other communities of color? So that's a lot. Let's start with parents. Let's start with educators of young people. I mean, kind of what's your philosophy? Or, I mean, you had mentioned learning things from your first kid to your second kid. I think about, the amount of formula you got to feed them, how many, pull-ups you're going to go through, right? Like, you learn so much from 1 to 2 as a parent of now some young ones. But seriously, what lessons did you learn when you're talking about, social justice in young people, and kind of what's your philosophy working with educators, parents, working with young people around teaching social justice to them?
Yeah. I knew that I needed to have conversations with my son, who is my first, about issues of social justice from a really young age. But I kind of felt like I was fumbling in the dark a little bit because, give me a room full of middle schoolers or high schoolers or adults. And, I feel like I know how to start the conversations and how to approach it. But like a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, how does that happen? And when my son was, I think he had just turned 3, we were driving somewhere and we passed a gentleman who was riding a bike who had darker skin, and my son said, he's Black. And I said, yeah. And, in my head, I'm thinking, I didn't explicitly teach that to him, and I need to figure this out now because he's already getting a narrative, and I want to be the primary one to be shaping that narrative. So by the time I had a second, my daughter, by the time she was 2.5 years old, she knew the term melanin. We talked a lot about how the more melanin someone had in their skin, the darker that they were, and how that was, in whatever ways that we could, that was connected to sun protection and geography. And, I was able to have those conversations with my son because he was older, and, we would look at maps, and we would talk about ancestors and where our ancestors were from and how that was connected to our skin color and different friends, because I remember the first really explicit racist lesson I remember learning as a kid was in first grade, when a white boy in my class told me that I shouldn't associate with or talk to a girl who I was sitting next to. And I have no memories of any of the kids really in my class up until this very point. And he told me that she was dirty. And I suddenly noticed her and, wondered, is that true? And, thinking back on that as an adult, my heart just absolutely breaks for that girl and what her experience must have been like and how traumatizing it must have been in that school system. It makes me wonder, where was the teacher? And it also makes me wonder, if my parents knew how to talk to me about these issues before I was in first grade, that I would have been equipped and I would have had accurate information so that I would have been able to say, you're wrong, she just has more melanin in her skin. Or if race was a regular part of our discourse as a family, then maybe I would have brought it to them and mentioned it, and at least in a reactive way, they could have helped me process it. But I also think now about the ways in which I was harmed in that moment. I learned a really important lesson about what it means to be different, and that it's not okay to be different. And we moved to a different town just a few months after that. But, maybe in those few months, she and I would have formed a bond and discovered that we had lots of things in common. And there was a piece of my humanity that was taken from me in that moment. And I knew that kids at my kids' preschools were already talking about skin color in a negative way associated with darker skin. A friend of one of my kids was told that she couldn't play because she was Black, and she was told this by a 3-year-old. And so I really wanted to be intentional about giving my kids accurate information in terms of genetics and biology, and also just talking about race constantly so that they would come to me when there were things that happened that I wasn't present for or I didn't hear. And my experience in working with especially white educators and white parents is that there's often this fear that talking with their kids about race is going to make them notice it. It's about color, the ideal of colorblindness, and also just a fear that talking about it is going to make the kids racist. Mm-hmm. And so, I try to help folks break that down, just by sharing with them the body of research, of which there is a tremendous amount that, as I'm certain you're aware, that as early as 6 months old, babies start to notice differences in skin tone, and by 4 to 5 years old, have across the board, regardless of racial background, have already started associating negative attributes with darker skin, of like scary or dangerous, unkind, and more positive attributes with lighter skin, of like kind, happy, joyful, safe. And that longitudinal studies have shown that over time, those associations are more likely to be corrected, at least somewhat, for kids of color, but rarely interrupted or problematized for white kids. And so the place I often take white adults, in talking about these issues is storytelling about their own early memories. Because when we talk about it through the lens of our own childhoods, and through the lens of adultism, of growing up in systems where adults controlled everything and there were choices that were taken away from us, and ways in which we were really pushed down as humans, that we learned racism. I learned racism, but I didn't ask to learn it. And so instead of feeling guilty about the racist thoughts that still pop into my head, or that, the things that I notice that I do that are a direct result of the racism I learned, instead of feeling guilty about that, I can feel angry. I can feel angry about the system that I grew up in and the schools. I can feel angry about the fact that nobody taught my parents how to talk about these issues. So they didn't know how to talk about these issues. And even though I didn't choose to learn the racism I did, I can also recognize and be honest about the fact that I did learn it, and maybe have some compassion for myself, for the ways in which I was harmed. The parts of my humanity were taken from me. The relationships were either severed or denied. The parts of white people that are specific ethnic identities were stripped away from us, as the price to pay for becoming white. But in being honest about the fact that I learned it, then I can help myself avoid getting stuck in guilt or shame, defensiveness, and I can just see with more clarity where the racism still lives and breathes inside of me, and I can work every day for the rest of my life to help dismantle that, and help my kids notice the racism that they have already learned, and to be as actively anti-racist as they can in their lives as they grow up.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and particularly adding that anti-racist connection, because it doesn't do anger any good if it's not connected to action. And I'm hoping that those watching, listening, are just learning from the stories, the experience from parent, teacher, community member, grandparent. That was just chock full of just great nuggets. I wish we could spend another half hour talking about that, but I got to go on to white people, white accountability, white resilience. I mean, your life experience around the work, your experience around colleagues and participants working with, that you work with, teachers that you work with, what's your sense of how white people are doing, grasping and understanding and grappling with and taking action around issues related to race, social justice, so on and so forth? And I'm also wondering, as a part of that, we've seen more and more white people in the history of diversity work now doing the work, leading the work. And I'm wondering, is your sense that that motivation is to make society better? Is it justice, or is it profit to make more money? Because diversity work now has become a $1 billion industry. So just giving you all of that under the category of white people, what's your thought? What's your reaction to that?
White people. I mean, I don't have any personal research to back this up, but my sense is that the majority of white people in this country don't even have this on their radar. And so we're already talking about a smaller segment of white population. And I think there is, there are all kinds of different models of racial identity development. I think the place where I often see white people is perhaps recognizing and seeing racial injustice, and maybe feeling like they want to do something about it, but not really understanding how they are connected to those systems of white supremacy, and the ways in which they both benefit from it and reinforce it. I think talking about white privilege has been has become more and more mainstream. It's came up in the Democratic debates with primaries. And I feel like the talking about white privilege is still very much done at arm's length, in that, it's easier to recognize other white people's racism and the ways in which other white people are messing up. And really to, I certainly went through this myself, where I remember I really felt like a better white person than other white people. And I just didn't really want to associate with them. I wanted to associate more with people of color and in all of the things that I did, because it made me feel better about myself to do that. And I also thought that the only way to do racial justice work, or the main way to do it, was with people of color. I didn't really understand many years ago the value and actually the critical importance of white people working together to create accountability for one another and to support one another through the stumbling blocks, the mistakes, the big feelings, so that we can stay in the work, and so that we don't have to burden people of color with having to take care of us, which is, certainly an historical theme. And so that we can really show up more authentically and with more humility when we do collaborate with people of color in racism work. Because if we just do it from arm's length and we are just talking about other white people's racism, we're missing a really big and really important piece of the puzzle, especially as parents or educators. How can we ask children to notice their mistakes, or to really notice the ways in which racism has started to trick their brains, their implicit biases? How can we ask kids to do that if we don't model it ourselves, if we don't model that humility and that thought process, and to normalize that process for kids? Like, how can we raise anti-racist children if we don't demonstrate our own personal process? Are you there, Eddie? Did I lose you?
No. What I was looking down here thinking about was the thing you had mentioned before around white affinity groups, white allyship. I mean, I'm just wondering, in the places and spaces where you've been with large groups of white folks who are doing this work, what's your sense and thought about how things are going, how folks are doing? Is there progress being made? Because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'm wondering if people are motivated by their participation because of the revenue associated with social justice, or the justice, the results associated with social justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the majority of folks with whom I interact in those affinity spaces, and I facilitated groups of 3 or 4 people to over 1,000, which bring their own challenges. Mostly those spaces are people who are educators or community workers, which are or diversity professionals within schools. And I think the majority of my experience is that people are in it because they really care. Whether or not they see their own complicity is a whole other thing. But my sense is that, especially in the last few years, especially since the 2016 election and the whole primary season leading up to that, I think that really, I think it lit a fire under a lot of white people's feet. I think it made it so that white folks who previously perhaps were in denial, maybe they thought that there were just these kind of fringe white supremacist groups, but then it becomes something, racist talking points of a major political party. I think it made it harder for white people to really ignore the problems and the realities that people of color were living every single day. I think leading up to that, the increased use of social media to really highlight and to document what people of color have been living all of this time. I think just the increased visibility has spurred more people to really want to do something, whether or not they know what to do or how to do it, or whether or not they see themselves as part of a problem is a whole other thing. But in terms of at least intention, I don't see as much of the money profit piece, but that also just might be because I'm seeing, like a segment of mostly educators, or, I also live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a much, it's a pretty blue area. And so, there's a lot of history of social justice work and anti-oppression work and anti-racism work in this area. So I think, maybe if I were doing this work in a different part of the country, or even just, 15 minutes outside of the main San Francisco Bay Area, because you don't have to go far in California to find super red areas. I think maybe my experience would be different, but
yeah. No, it's helpful because I've been in both of those spaces, and and hoping, one, that question is being asked and that's being assessed about all of us participating in this work, from folks of color to white folks, but primarily white folks, just because of the dynamics of how oppression and racism works and who bears the pain around that. But to know that there are some spaces where folks are feeling, trusted folks are feeling, that's not the motivation that's really helpful for me. I want to ask you now about that third point you talked about, some of your work in the area of anti-Semitism, white Jewish identity, because I mean, I thought those two things were the same, like white and Jewish. So I've had to do some work learning myself, and also I think having some personal kind of negative things around Jewish folks, having to do some work around building my skills to build a better white Jewish, specifically in African-American relationship building. Mm-hmm. And so all of that to just get a sense on, from you, your experience in working around anti-Semitic issues, the state of that in today's society, relationship between white and Jewish, and then also some collaborative partnerships. Are you seeing some of those things happen between particularly white Jewish and other folks of color communities, African American, just being one example?
Yeah. Before I get to that, while you were talking, I remembered another piece around the connection of diversity practitioners and financial considerations. I think the conversations that I've had more with white diversity practitioners is really them grappling with, should I even be getting paid for this? Is me getting paid for doing anti-racism work a part of the problem? And really struggling with but if I don't get paid for it, then I can't make a living, and then I can't actually devote myself to this work. So I think that's more of the struggle that I encounter with folks around anti-racism work and finances. So a lot of people, especially in this country, associate Jewish with white, and I think very often just use Jewish to mean white people instead of saying white Jews. But there's a very large population of Jews of color in this country and also around the world. I mentioned that my ancestors are Ashkenazi Jewish from Central and Eastern Europe. But there are Sephardic Jews who are from the area of Spain, Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, Ethiopian Jews, Kaifeng Jewish communities in China. And so, as a white Jewish person, I also try as much as I can to talk about myself as a white Jew. I think the reason I've been really fascinated with and really drawn to this particular intersection of my whiteness and my Jewishness is because over the years in doing this work, I've had really interesting and initially surprising experiences with white Jews who were participants in work that I was doing, regardless of whether or not it was a white affinity or white accountability space or mixed race group, where I often heard other white Jews saying things like, well, I'm not white, I'm Jewish, which has an even different flavor to me than like, I'm not white, I'm Italian, or I'm not white, I'm Irish. And also, being a participant myself in white affinity or white accountability spaces, it doesn't necessarily feel safe to talk about my Jewishness because those spaces are they're predominantly Christian. And so talking about Christian hegemony and the connection between how Christian hegemony birthed whiteness and white supremacy doesn't really feel safe. And in mixed race settings, it also doesn't necessarily feel appropriate, or I feel very cautious. And I know other white Jews in this work do too, feel really cautious about talking about that intersection and the specific ways in which we are white and not as white as other white people who are Christian. And this goes for, other intersections for white people of other marginalized identities around gender and sexual orientation and class, etc. And so I just really felt like, in mixed race spaces, there's often, I think, a fear that white Jews have, as I've certainly experienced that, of feeling afraid that if I talk about that intersection, that it's going to be interpreted as me denying my whiteness or trying to water down my whiteness. And so I've just only recently started to try to create spaces for white Jews to explore those intersections together. The first place I did it was at the White Privilege Symposium in New England. So thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of pilot that. Because especially a few years, there's a real vulnerability that I feel as a Jewish person, as a parent of Jewish children, fear for my safety, for my children's safety, in a way that my whiteness, my class, my geography, I think have largely protected me from. That the experiences of anti-Semitism that I had growing up were, I'd say incredibly mild, and I was like really protected from a lot of that compared to, say, my father's experience growing up as a first-generation American son of Ukrainian immigrants in New York City. That was a very different experience for him. And I think a lot of people thought that anti-Semitism was gone, or, a lot of people would talk about it as just something from World War II, and that, suddenly as the Nazi Holocaust was over, that was it. And so I think the violent events that are more public, the ways in which white power and white supremacist groups have really been emboldened in the last several years, have really highlighted for people how anti-Semitism is still very much a living, breathing thing. And I can also talk about it from the perspective of trauma. About a year ago, I discovered Resmaa Menakem's brilliant book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathways to Healing Our Hearts and Bodies. I think I'm getting that subtitle correct. And as a survivor of sexual trauma myself, these are issues of trauma have been things that I think about all the time, that I've been thinking about for a very long time and working on my own personal healing. And the book is really an experience. It's not something you just read. Resmaa Menakem is a trauma specialist, therapist, who also specializes in somatic therapy, body-based healing. Because talking away trauma isn't really a thing. It's something that lives in our bodies. And so we can't really heal from trauma unless we heal our bodies. But it was the first time that I really heard somebody talk about, a Black man talk about the trauma, the ways in which white people are traumatized by racism, which wasn't really something that I totally understood. I understood that they took pieces of my humanity from me, but I never really used the word trauma in relation to that identity for myself. And I actually heard him interviewed. You can just just go on YouTube and, just type in his name. And it's like a 30-minute interview that he gives about his book. But one of the things he talks about is the white children who were brought to lynchings, and how everything around them and everyone around them told them that it was right, that it was normal. But everything that we know about children witnessing violence and the ways in which that is traumatizing to them, the secondary trauma of that, and everything that we know now about epigenetics, or the little bit that we now know, that there's so much more to know about epigenetics and the ways in which trauma actually changes the ways in which our DNA is expressed and gets passed down biologically. Just really kind of cracked something open for me, because I understood already the ways in which the pogroms, the killings of my ancestors in Central and Eastern Europe, and then certainly the Holocaust, the 25% of my family members who were killed, the family members of mine who were here who had to witness that and know what was happening but not be able to do anything, and the adaptive survival behaviors that were kind of culturally created as a way of responding to that trauma. There's a whole traumatic backstory to the stereotype of the overprotective Jewish mother. There are reasons why I am overly concerned with my children's comfort, that actually has a hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of year old history. But to kind of combine that with this new piece that I got from Resma Medicum and thinking about, how have I inherited that? My ancestors weren't here for that, but as a white person, I have learned that. My parents learned that, and their parents learned it, even though they were new to the country. And so, reading through his book, there was this moment where it just kind of suddenly hit me in a really visceral way, where I felt like the white supremacy that I have learned and internalized, that is, coursing through my veins, is the same white supremacy that was responsible for my ancestors' genocide. And I kind of that was just a really heavy place to come to, in thinking about and learning more about the ways in which the Nazis used the U.S. system as a model. Their Nuremberg laws were based on Jim Crow. Their eugenics program was an extension of the U.S. eugenics program. Their forced sterilizations were an explicit model after what was happening in the United States. And, for all of the Nazis' faults, they were really good at documentation. And they have documented conversations among leaders of the Nazi Party specifically talking about what was happening in the United States and debating actually whether or not it was too extreme or not. And so, what does it mean for me to have those two pieces in me? And where are the opportunities for healing that trauma live in my body? And how can I work together with other white Jews around that healing and that specific intersection?
Now, I want to ask you a question about parents like ourselves, like parents of young kids. I mean, I have a 9-year-old, I have a 2-year-old. You also have some young kids. And I'm wondering, if you were in a room full of parents like ourselves, what would be your message to them? But before that, I want to ask you about something you had mentioned earlier, survival, and survival care versus self-care, because this work that we do can be trying and heavy and emotional. You mentioned the trauma of the learning, of the reading, of the preparation, the resistance in the workshops. And on top of that, the times and things going on around us, it can be heavy. Can you talk quickly about self-care versus survival care?
Yeah. I think something I'd mentioned in a different conversation you and I had. I actually first came to that just in my own therapy. It was in talking about my role as a parent, that, I think especially those of us parents of young kids, our meals are often our children's leftovers. And if we get to go to the bathroom without somebody in the bathroom or trying to climb on us, it's, it feels like a really special experience. Or, folding laundry feels like a break if I'm not simultaneously trying to actively parent. But I can listen to my own music in the car sometimes, or, take a shower that's longer than 60 seconds. I used to think about those things as self-care, like, even though I'm just eating my kids' leftovers, I'm feeding myself. So, that's self-care. But what I really think about that now as survival care. And it's really different than me thinking intentionally about what do I need? What does my body need? What does my mind need in order to feel resilient? And I, about a year ago, I actually learned from a therapist of mine who learned it incidentally from her therapist, this metaphor of an orange peel, talking about our protective membranes, that an orange peel is designed to keep the juice and everything in, but also designed to keep things out, to protect the inside. And that we all have these protective membranes, or our own orange peels, if you will. And if I don't do things to tend to my orange peel, it's going to be in tatters. And then I'm not going to be able to be resilient in the face of external stresses or things coming towards me. And I'm also going to be more likely to just spill my own stuff on other people, especially these days, my family. And so, I really have to think about what are the things that work for me to really fortify my protective membrane. And for me, that's singing, playing piano, making art, being outside. And I can talk with my kids about this too. And I really just recently thought about this, particularly with my daughter, who, unless she changes her gender, is going to be a white woman. And, all of the talk that people have had in the last few years about white tears and white fragility based on Robin DiAngelo's work, which, lots of friends of color of mine have said is like, yeah, we knew this already. Like all of a sudden it took a white woman to say this for white people to really hear it. It was an important thing to notice. But, like, how do I teach my white kids to really have their own protective membranes, so that when they mess up and somebody calls them on, their racist actions, or anything else, that they can actually persevere through that. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, some of how I'm framing the survival versus self-care.
Yeah, I like the orange peel analogy. Being a learner, a visual learner, that really helps me protecting the inside as well as keeping yourself protected, so to speak. I'm going to be thinking more about that. I was going to ask you about your message to parents of young kids in light of today's society. What would be your PSA message to those folks like ourselves who are looking at people who are going to be in this world for the next 50 years, hopefully picking up our work or picking up on our work? What's your message to folks like us living, working with, taking care of folks in the age of our young kids, 2 to 10?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this resilience piece and this idea of protective membrane in relation to my kids. They're, as I'm sure as a parent of 2 kids, they're remarkably, I imagine they're remarkably different creatures, even though they're, are being raised in the same household. And this whole shelter in place situation and the pandemic affects everybody. I'm certainly seeing that it is outwardly affecting my kids differently. But the way I've actually taken that orange peel metaphor and brought it to my kids is
Okay, we lost her. I don't know if that was me. Can you hear me, Jenny?
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Pause recording.
Pause. All right, so quickly, I want to ask you one last thing about parents, parenting. I mean, as the parents of two young kids, myself and you, of course, having two young kids, I'm wondering what's your message to parents like us who are really raising young people who will be doing this work, hopefully, or picking up on this work for the next 50 years. What's your message to those parents?
Mm-hmm. I think, I think really focusing on resilience, especially in the days of coronavirus pandemic, is really important. This whole situation it affects everybody differently, and it certainly affects our children, even if they're not necessarily talking about it. And so, one of the ways that I've actually tried to introduce the idea of resilience in a visual way for my kids who are 9 and just turned 7, my 9-year-old's almost 10, is instead of using the orange peel metaphor, I remembered that there was this scene in the Wonder Woman movie where she emerges from the bunker with her sword and her shield, and eventually winds up crouching down behind her shield, taking all of the fire. And it was just a way for me to show the kids this notion that they have invisible shields. And so now we talk about the things that they need to keep their shields strong. And notice, when they're starting to have a hard time really controlling their bodies. We can talk about, what is it that you need to really fortify your shield right now? Do you need food? Do you need to move your body? Do you need to hit something? Do you need to just be alone for a while? What is it that you need? And I think encouraging kids to kind of really develop that practice is really going to serve them well in life and also in this work, because this work is it's exhausting. It can be really exhausting. And if we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't really do self-care, if we don't tend to our protective membranes, our orange peels, then we can't really stay in the work. And our children won't be able to stay in the work. And so I think, the resilience is certainly one piece. And the other piece, especially for parents these days, because, our kids aren't at school, is to just really use this as an opportunity to talk with our kids all the time about what's happening in the world, about issues of social justice, and lots of opportunities to read books for white parents of white kids. Teach your kids about white people in history who did anti-racism work, so that they can have role models, so that it's not so much that the only white adults they're seeing is people who are actively racist, and use this as an opportunity to just, if you haven't already, make it a part of your discourse. Just talk about it all the time. Model your own process, because you have opportunities now to have conversations with your kids and the time to do so that maybe you didn't before.
Well, Sarah, we have appreciated you coming on. I want to ask you to close out by telling us how to find you and your work, as well as if you want to mention any resources, any books, any music, any shows, TV shows, anything you've been watching during quarantine, reading, listening to, that would be helpful around this subject matter, or self-care. Just give people a chance to laugh or get away. Can you close out giving us a little bit about how to find yourself and anything you've been reading, watching, listening to that you'd like to add to our list?
Sure. I'll start with, people can find me at my website, www.courageouschange, all one word, .org. And my information is there to get in touch with me or learn more about me and some of my work. I was listening a few weeks ago to actually a webinar that the organization Embrace Race, embracerace.org, I think is their website, where they were talking specifically about anti-Asian racism in light of COVID and the ways in which we're, of course, seeing an uptick in anti-Asian racism, acts of violence, harassment, and specifically as it relates to parenting in schools. And I think that they have posted that webinar, the recording of that webinar, on their website, and they have all kinds of other really great resources. So I highly encourage parents in particular to get on their email list. They send out really great resources and have all kinds of opportunities for parents to engage with one another in community. I'm also always a really big fan of Sandra Kim, who has her own organization, and one of the online courses that she has is I'm forgetting the exact name of it, but it's a course for white allies, healing. It's like a healing from whiteness, and she's a person of color and leads these spaces, also through the lens of trauma, which I always appreciate. And so that's something that's always available to folks. Yeah, I think those are some good places to start. I'll also share some of my own somatic practices that I found useful. As parents, even if we recognize our orange peels are in tatters, we don't really have time to fortify them, or we're in the middle of something and noticing that we're just 5 seconds away from completely losing it with our kids. One thing that I sometimes do is I'll just put my back up against a wall and just close my eyes and just really focus on feeling my spine. And another practice I sometimes do is just pushing as hard as I can against a wall. That there's a way of the intense and sometimes angry or frustrated energy that's like spinning inside of us when we just want to get away. Like our flight response is a flight or fight response. We're going to unleash something in a moment, or we just need to run away, and neither one of them is possible or good options at the time. That just like leaning against a cabinet or a wall and just like pushing as hard as you can, that just like discharging some of that energy can really be helpful.
Yeah. Well, speaking of helpful, you've given us a lot of nuggets in this time, and I really have always appreciated your love and support for myself and the conference. And as long as you want to collaborate, be in partnership, we'll collaborate with you. You're always welcome at the White Privilege Conference. And thank you again for all your support. And I'll look forward to another 25 years of doing the work. As long as the work is out there, I will always be willing to be in collaboration with you to do the work.
Thanks, Eddie. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I've admired your work for a really long time. So I feel really honored to even be invited to be a part of this. I think it's a brilliant idea because we go to the conference, we don't always get a chance to really get to know people. And so way to make lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah, appreciate that. Well, Jenny and I will definitely link all of your, well, Jenny will link all your information. She's definitely taking this to the next level, and we'll be sure to tag you when it's posted, but I'll also send this to you. But again, thank you. Sending you a Wakanda hug. Be safe. My best to the family. Peace.
All right. Thanks. Bye, Eddie.
Bye-bye.